Whew, Latin 4. So we have a thing to talk about. I'm not going to be making a lot of videos for you guys specifically because so much of what there is to make a video on is stuff that we did in Latin 3 or Latin 2 or Latin 1. I mean, the vast majority of the grammatical topics happen way before Latin 4. So there's just not that much left. And yet there is still more than nothing. There is the supine. Ooh, and it's a hard one to talk about because this is not a thing that we have in English. It just isn't. So I can't easily point to an exact example and say this is a supine because anything that the supine does in English, in Latin, English does with some other part of speech, usually an infinitive. And I'll explain why in a moment. Actually, honestly, I can't even tell you why it's called a supine. There is a reason. There's a grammatical reason for all the names of the technical terms, but I happen to not remember this one. And honestly, I'm not going to go back and look that up. There are a lot more important things to know about it. For instance, what it looks like. So if I come down here, I've got a lot of stuff on the board for this one. This is obviously the principal parts of the verb amo, amare, to love, right? A verb that we all know, we've seen it a bunch of times, pretty easy to understand and manipulate, all right? And the fourth principal part, which we have talked about in past classes, is referred to as the supine stem. So you have heard me use this word before, and yet we've never actually gone over what a supine is or why the fourth principal part is called the supine stem. Instead, what we learned was that the fourth principal part is used for making perfect passive things, perfect passive participles, perfect passive verbs, etc., right? But it is, in fact, also used to make the supine. That's the thing that it is named for, and it does do that thing. And this actually kind of explains a discrepancy. Depending on what dictionary you're looking at, the fourth principal part might be written one of a few different ways. In many dictionaries, including your textbook, it's not spelled this way. Instead, it's spelled amatus. And what those dictionaries are doing is they're making the orthographical choice to put the more common form in the fourth principal part rather than the actual supine. Because way more often than you use supines, you use perfect passive participles. And that's what amatus is. It's the masculine form of the perfect passive participle. But some dictionaries don't put amatus, they put amatum. And it might look like they're just using the neuter form of the participle, but they're not. What they're doing is they're putting in the actual supine for the fourth principal part. And one of the reasons why a dictionary might make this orthographical choice is because while some dictionaries are thinking, well, let's just put a participle because that's the form that most students are going to be using most of the time, it does present kind of an interesting problem, right? Some verbs can't really be made passive. And how could you put the perfect passive participle there if it can't really be passive? You would never see it. So then if that dictionary has chosen to use participles in the supine stem, they'll end up replacing the perfect passive participle with a future active participle because it uses the same supine stem, it just adds a UR to it. And so if you've ever wondered why sometimes the fourth principal part in your textbook has UR in it, it's because there's a weird thing with the participles and they don't want to put in a participle that doesn't exist. But if you put in the supine, you don't have to worry about that. The supine doesn't have a UR in it, it just always ends in UM because what the supine is it's a verbal noun, all right? I know this is going to be weird to think about because we already know verbal nouns. We have infinitives, which are technically a type of verbal noun, and we also have gerunds, which are a type of verbal noun. So in fact, there are 3 types of verbal nouns, and that probably just seems like dumb and frustrating. Like, why do we need so many verbal nouns? And the truth is we really don't need that many. There's a reason why this exists in Latin and not in English. It's one of the things that has fallen away in Indo-European languages. So we just don't have it anymore. It has ceased to exist. But we are students of ancient Latin, and it did still exist then, so we need to know what it is so that we can interpret it when it shows up. All right? And specifically, it's going to be a fourth declension verbal noun. All right? So it's always in the fourth declension. So really what this amatum is it's the accusative form of amatus, amatus, right? With the US and then the long US. And technically you could totally see, fourth declension nouns that are derived from verbs in any case. Theoretically, you could do that. You probably won't, and it's not considered a supine. unless it's in the accusative or the ablative. All right. That probably seems really weird, but I'm going to explain why. Like, supines only get used in these two cases. There are some very hoity-toity academic arguments about why this is, and about whether or not it could show up in another case, but I'm not going to get into that. I'm going to get into what you're actually going to see, which is the supine in the ablative or the accusative, and I'm going to start with the ablative because I think it's the easier one to understand, certainly the easier one to translate. With this one, you're literally just going to translate the supine as if it's an infinitive. It's not, it's different, but that's the way you're going to use it, all right? And I have, as you can see here, a list of words that are apparently in the ablative supine form. And the reason I put this list of words here is because these are actually way far and away the most common ones. There's only a handful of these that you're likely to see. Theoretically, you could do this with any verb, but they don't practically do it with just any verb. They mostly do it with just one of a few. I think there's like 7 that basically encompass almost all of the ones that show up. And rather than look up that list of 7, I just wrote down these 4 because I know I see these 4. I've seen them often. And the way you end up translating them is just to say, to hear, to say, to see, to hear, to say, to do. I know I misspoke. I should probably refilm this, but it's going to be long and I have a lot to do today, so there's going to be some misspeaks probably. Sorry. Anyway. And to get back to these, though, you're going to translate them like an infinitive, but they're not going to show up in just any instance that an infinitive would. Instead, they're going to show up specifically and most commonly with adjectives that either have something to do with feelings, or is the adjective easy or the adjective hard. All right. In fact, Latin 4 on Tuesday, I think when we read, you're going to see one of these. That's why I'm doing this video now. And I believe it's actually with the adjective easy. Like, you're going to see exactly one of these examples. So, but I went ahead and wrote some of my own sentences as examples that you can see here. So looking at this, we actually have a couple of verbal nouns happening here, because not only did I put in some supines as examples, we also have an infinitive in here too. What this sentence actually says is, to live rightly is easy to say, hard to do. It's the kind of nice moralistic sentence that I'm sure like a Cicero or a Cato would love. I don't particularly like either of those guys, but I think they would approve of this sentiment, and it is true. To live rightly is easy to say, hard to do, which is to say, you know, you got to walk that walk and talk that talk. You got to do both, but one is easier than the other one. But what's going on here, and the reason why you would have this construction is basically it's saying that doing this thing is easy in speaking, but it is hard in doing. These are considered ablatives of specification, all right? That's what they're considered, ablatives of specification, okay? So yeah, so this is a real common type of example in which you might see an ablative supine. Another real common one is verbs that have to do with feeling, things being amazing or terrible or shocking or whatever. So what we have here is my cat has no feet to bite, sad to think when I am not home. Cogitatu is not one that I would actually expect you to see. I went ahead and made an example with some other one, because again, theoretically, you could do this with any verb. It's just some are a lot more likely than others, but this is exactly the kind of thing that they would in fact do. Triste cogitatu, sad to think, right? It's kind of just this interjection. I think the most common one I've seen in the past is mirabile dictu, wonderful to say, or amazing to say, but yeah, like, you know, this is the kind of feeling interjection that they love to do, which is to say that this thing, this situation that I'm describing is sad in thinking about it. It's your ablative of specification there. How is it sad? It's sad in thinking about it, or when you think about it. And I did put up one more example. This is less common, but it is something that's attested in the grammar, so I went ahead and put it here. when you see this, it's almost always going to be with an adjective like one of those in the previous two examples, but rarely it could get used with a verb or also phos, nephos, or opus. So I used one with nephos here, which is to say it is forbidden, it is nephos to know what someone would do for love. All right? Or again, if you want to think of it in that ablative of specification sense, it is forbidden with respect to knowing what someone would do for love. I mean, Meatloaf says it would be anything, but not that. And how is that clarifying in any way? I don't know. I don't know. But guys, let's move on to accusative supines. Now, this really is almost an entirely other topic. It's still the same part of speech, this certain type of verbal noun, but used to a very different end. All right? What the accusative supine does is it shows purpose. And already that might seem weird. Like, again, kind of like with the supine in general, you might think, well, why do I need that? And the truth is, you don't really, right? Because there's already several other ways to show purpose. You can show purpose with a purpose clause, something we learned about at the end of Latin 2. You can show purpose with a gerundive, something that we learned about early in Latin 3. In fact, I even had one in one of those examples just a moment ago. Mordendus, it's a gerundive. You can show purpose even with a dative. There is such a thing as a dative of purpose, which we talked about toward the end of Latin 3. It wasn't in our Latin 3 books, I don't think, but we talked about it anyway. You can also show purpose with a supine, all right? But it's not just any scenario with a supine. The accusative supine is specifically something that works with a verb of motion, okay? So as an example here, it says veniam auditorium auditum musicam. So my verb of motion obviously is veniam. I will come auditorium to the listening hall, the listening place. That's what an auditorium is. I'm just going to call it a concert hall. I will come to the concert hall to hear music. All right? I'm still translating this like an infinitive, even though, again, it's not technically an infinitive, but the infinitive is kind of the closest thing that we have in English. And in fact, showing purpose with the infinitive is actually a fifth way you can show purpose in Latin, although it is extremely rare. That's why I don't let you do it in composition assignments, because classical Romans didn't tend to do that. This is, compared to some of the other ways to show purpose, also relatively rare, but it does show up. So we need to know what it's going to look like for when it does show up. And when it shows up is with verbs of motion. I will come to the concert hall to hear music. Well, maybe after the pandemic. Dear. And you'll notice here that not only is this showing purpose, but because it is a verbal noun, it's actually also taking a direct object. This is a direct object, but it's not the direct object of my verb. It's the direct object of my supine, to hear music. Because any active verbal idea can take on a direct object. It's totally a thing. Not just active verbs, but active infinitives, active participles. Gerunds can do it, and even supines. All right? I'm going to go off on a slight tangent here before I give the last two examples. This is also the way, I did not write this down, so you have to take my word for it, but this is also how the future passive infinitive exists. In Latin 2, when I teach that, I go ahead and tell you that it does not exist. And it is certainly not in our Ecce Romani textbooks, but if you look around online, oftentimes online sources will have the future active infinitive there, even though I have told you it doesn't exist. And the way it exists, if you consider this existing, and again, there's esoteric academic arguments about whether or not this counts, is it's the passive infinitive of ire, so it's iri, I-R-I, plus the supine of whatever verb you want to make future and passive. So as if there's like a motion toward that thing happening. It's really weird to think about, and so rare as to not be worth talking about. Not being worth talking about unless you absolutely have to. Sorry, AP kids, one of these does show up in Caesar, so we'll talk about it then. But to show you a couple more examples of the accusative supine that is not that thing, just, the regular accusative supine, I do have a couple more examples here. So Leia, which is also one of my cats, Leia climbed on to the bed to bite my feet. I don't know what is up with these cats and biting my feet, but they love doing it. And this would be her purpose for climbing up on the bed. She did this thing, which is a verb of motion, and she did it for this purpose, to bite my feet. Usually when it's a verb of motion with the supine, it's usually going to be eo ire or veni o venire. Those are the most common ones. But any verb of motion can do it if the reason why you were moving was to accomplish a task. So I have one last example here. Let us go home to sleep, which, boy, could I really go for right now. But I can't. Instead, I need to upload this video, and I need to, do 15 other things for work today. So I'm going to go do that. Latin for AP, if you guys have questions about this stuff, as always, let me know. And we'll see these soon. All right.